The Amazon River in South America is the largest river by discharge of water in the world, and the longest in length. The headwaters of the Apurimac River on Nevado Musme had been considered for nearly a century as the Amazon's most distant source, until a 2014 study found it to be the Cordillera Rumicras at the headwaters of the Mantaro River in Peru. The Mantaro and Apurimac confluence, and with other tributaries form the Ucayali, which in turn confluences with the river Marañón upstream of Iquitos, Peru, to form what countries other than Brazil consider to be the main stem of the Amazon. Brazilians call this section of the river the Solomos above its confluence with the Rio Negro to form what Brazilians call the Amazon at the meeting of waters at Manaus, the river's largest city, at an average discharge of about 209,000 cubic meters per second, approximately 6,591 cubic kilometers per annum, greater than the next 7 largest independent rivers combined. The Amazon represents 20% of the global riverine discharge to the ocean. The Amazon basin is the largest drainage basin in the world, with an area of approximately 7,050,000 square kilometers, and accounts for roughly 1/5 of the world's total river flow. The portion of the river's drainage basin in Brazil alone is larger than any other river's basin. The Amazon enters Brazil with only 1/5 of the flow it finally discharges into the Atlantic Ocean, yet already has a greater flow at this point than the discharge of any other river. History. Pre-colonial civilization. During what many archaeologists call the formative period, Amazonian societies were deeply involved in the emergence of South America's highland agrarian systems. This possibly contributed to the social and religious institutions essential to the order of Andean civilization. Early human settlements were typically based on low-lying hills or mounds. 5 types of archaeological mound have been noted in the Amazon region: shell refuse and artificial mounds, artificial earth platforms for entire villages, earth mounds and ridges for cultivation, causeways and canals, and figurative mounds, both geometric and biomorphic. Shell mounds were the earliest. They represent piles of human refuse and are mainly dated between 7,500 and 4,000 BP. They all represent Pottery Age cultures. No pre-ceramic shell mounds have been documented so far by archaeologists. Artificial earth platforms for entire villages are the second type of mounds. They are best represented by the Maya-era culture. Figurative mounds are the latest chronologically. There is ample evidence that the areas surrounding the Amazon River were home to complex and large-scale indigenous societies, mainly chiefdoms who developed large towns and cities. Archaeologists estimate that by the time the Spanish conquistador Orellana journeyed across the Amazon in 1541, more than 3 million Indians lived around the Amazon. These pre-Columbian settlements created highly developed civilizations. For instance, pre-Columbian indigenous people on the island of Marajo may have developed social stratification and supported a population of 100,000 people. In order to achieve this level of development, the Native Americans of the Amazon rainforest altered the forest's ecology by selective cultivation and the use of fire. Scientists argued that by burning areas of the forest repetitiously, the indigenous people caused the soil to become rich in nutrients. This created dark soil areas known as terra preta de Indio. Because of the terra preta, indigenous communities were able to make land fertile and thus sustainable for the large-scale agriculture needed to support the large populations and complex social structures. Further research has hypothesized that this practice began around 11,000 years ago. Some say that its effects on forest ecology and regional climate explained the otherwise inexplicable band of lower rainfall through the Amazon basin. Many indigenous tribes engaged in constant warfare. James Stewart Olson wrote, "The Munduruku expansion dislocated and displaced the Kawahibu, breaking the tribe down into much smaller groups. First came to the attention of Europeans in 1770 when they began a series of widespread attacks on Brazilian settlements along the Amazon River. European discovery in March 1500, Spanish conquistador Vicente Yanez Pinzon was the first documented European to sail into the river. Pinzon called the river flow Rio Santa Maria del Mar Dulce, later shortened to Mar Dulce. Another Spanish explorer, Francisco de Orellana, was the first European man to travel from the founts situated in the Andes to the end of the river. In this travel, Orellana baptized some of the affluents of the Amazonas like Rio Negro, Napo, Jurua. The name Amazonas came from the natives warriors that attacked this expedition, mostly women, that reminded Orellana of the woman warriors the Amazons from the Hellenic culture. Exploration. Gonzalo Pizarro set off in 1541 to explore east of Quito into the South American interior in search of El Dorado, the city of gold, and La Canela, the valley of cinnamon. He was accompanied by his second-in-command Francisco de Orellana. After 170 kilometers, the Coca River joined the Napo River. The party stopped for a few weeks to build a boat just upriver from this confluence. They continued downriver through an uninhabited area, where they could not find food. Orellana offered and was ordered to follow the Napo River, then known as Rio de la Canela, and return with food for the party. Based on intelligence received from a captive native chief named Delacola, they expected to find food within a few days downriver by ascending another river to the north. Orellana took about 57 men, the boat, and some canoes and left Pizarro's party on the 26th of December 1541. However, Orellana apparently missed the confluence where he was to look for food. By the time he and his men reached another village, many of them were sick from hunger and eating noxious plants, and near death. 7 men died at that village. His men threatened to mutiny if he followed his orders, and the expedition turned back to join Pizarro's larger party. He accepted to change the purpose of the expedition to discover new lands in the name of the King of Spain, and the men built a larger boat in which to navigate downstream. After a journey of 600 kilometers down the Napo River, they reached a further major confluence at a point near modern Iquitos, and then followed the upper Amazon, now known as the Solomos, for a further 1,200 kilometers to its confluence with the Rio Negro, which they reached on the 3rd of June 1542. On the Namunda River, a tributary of the Amazon downstream from Manaus, Orellana's party had a fierce battle with warriors who, they reported, were led by fierce female warriors who beat the men to death with clubs if they tried to retreat. Orellana's men began referring to the women as Amazons, a reference to the women of Greek mythology. The river was initially known as the Marañón Rio de Orellana. It later became known as the Rio Amazonas, the name by which it is still known in both Spanish and Portuguese. Regarding the initial mission of finding cinnamon, Pizarro reported to the king that they had found cinnamon trees, but that they could not be profitably harvested. In fact, true cinnamon is not native to South America. Other related cinnamon-containing plants are fairly common in that part of the Amazon, and Pizarro probably saw some of these. The expedition reached the mouth of the Amazon on the 24th of August 1542, demonstrating the practical navigability of the great river. In 1560, another Spanish conquistador, Lope de Aguirre, may have made the second descent of the Amazon. Historians are uncertain whether the river he descended was the Amazon or the Orinoco River, which runs more or less parallel to the Amazon further north. Portuguese explorer Pedro Teixeira was the first European to travel up the entire river. He arrived in Quito in 1637 and then returned via the same route. From 1648 to 1652, Portuguese-Brazilian bandeirante Antonio Raposo Tavares led an expedition from São Paulo overland to the mouth of the Amazon, investigating many of its tributaries, including the Rio Negro, and covering a distance of more than 10,000 kilometers. In what is currently Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela, a number of colonial and religious settlements were established along the banks of primary rivers and tributaries for the purpose of trade, slaving and evangelization among the indigenous peoples of the vast rainforest, such as the Urarina. In the late 1600s, Spanish Jesuit Father Samuel Fritz, apostle of the Omeguas, established some 40 mission villages. Scientific exploration. Early scientific, zoological and botanical exploration of the Amazon River and basin occurred in the second half of 18th century through the first half of the 19th century. Charles Marie de la Condamine explored the river in 1743. Alexander von Humboldt, 1799–1804, Johann Baptist von Spix and Carl Friedrich Philipp von Martius, 1817–1820, Henry Walter Bates and Alfred Russel Wallace, 1848–1859. Post-colonial exploitation and settlement. The Cabanajum revolt was directed against the white ruling class. It is estimated that from 30 to 40% of the population of Grão Pará, estimated at 100,000 people, died. The total population of the Brazilian portion of the Amazon basin in 1850 was perhaps 300,000, of whom about two-thirds were Europeans and slaves. The slaves amounting to about 25,000. The Brazilian Amazon's principal commercial city, Pará, had from 10,000 to 12,000 inhabitants, including slaves. The town of Manaus, now Manaus, at the mouth of the Rio Negro, had a population between 1,000 and 1,500. All the remaining villages, as far up as Tabatinga on the Brazilian frontier of Peru, were relatively small. On 6 September 1850, Emperor Pedro II of Brazil sanctioned a law authorizing steam navigation on the Amazon and gave the Viscount of Maua the task of putting it into effect. He organized the Companhia de Navegação e Comércio do Amazonas in Rio de Janeiro in 1852. In the following year it commenced operations with 4 small steamers, the Monacar, the Cometa, the Maranhão and the Rio Negro. At first, navigation was principally confined to the main river, and even in 1857 a modification of the government contract only obliged the company to a monthly service between Pará and Manaus. With steamers of 200 tons cargo capacity, a second line to make 6 round voyages a year between Manaus and Tabatinga, and a third, 2 trips a month between Pará and Cometa. This was the first step in opening up the vast interior. The success of the venture called attention to the opportunities for economic exploitation of the Amazon, and a second company soon opened commerce on the Madeira, Puris and Negro. A third established a line between Pará and Manaus, and a fourth found it profitable to navigate some of the smaller streams. In that same period, the Amazonas Company was increasing expanding its fleet. Meanwhile, private individuals were building and running small steam craft of their own on the main river as well as on many of its tributaries. On the 31st of July 1867, the government of Brazil, constantly pressed by the maritime powers and by the countries encircling the upper Amazon basin, especially Peru, decreed the opening of the Amazon to all countries, but they limited this to certain defined points: Tabatinga on the Amazon, Camata on the Tocantins, Santarém on the Tapajós, Borba on the Madeira, and Manaus on the Rio Negro. The Brazilian decree took effect on the 7th of September 1867. Thanks in part to the mercantile development associated with steamboat navigation coupled with the internationally driven demand for natural rubber, the Peruvian city of Iquitos became a thriving, cosmopolitan center of commerce. Foreign companies settled in Iquitos, from whence they controlled the extraction of rubber. In 1851, Iquitos had a population of 200, and by 1900 its population reached 20,000. In the 1860s, approximately 3,000 tons of rubber was being exported annually, and by 1911 annual exports had grown to 44,000 tons, representing 9.3% of Peru's exports. During the rubber boom, it is estimated that diseases brought by immigrants, such as typhus and malaria, killed 40,000 native Amazonians. The first direct foreign trade with Manaus commenced around 1874. Local trade along the river was carried on by the English successors to the Amazonas Company, the Amazon Steam Navigation Company, as well as numerous small steamboats belonging to companies and firms engaged in the rubber trade, navigating the Negro, Madeira, Puris and many other tributaries, such as the Maranon, to ports as distant as Nauta, Peru. By the turn of the 20th century, the exports of the Amazon basin were India rubber, cacao beans, Brazil nuts and a few other products of minor importance, such as pelts and exotic forest produce and extracted goods, such as lumber and gold. 20th century developments since colonial times. The Portuguese portion of the Amazon basin has remained a land largely undeveloped by agriculture and occupied by indigenous people who survived the arrival of European diseases. 4 centuries after the European discovery of the Amazon River, the total cultivated area in its basin was probably less than 65 square kilometers, excluding the limited and crudely cultivated areas among the mountains at its extreme headwaters. This situation changed dramatically during the 20th century. Wary of foreign exploitation of the nation's resources, Brazilian governments in the 1940s set out to develop the interior, away from the seaboard where foreigners owned large tracts of land. The original architect of this expansion was President Getulio Vargas, with the demand for rubber from the Allied forces in World War II providing funding for the drive. In 1960, the construction of the new capital city of Brasília in the interior also contributed to the opening up of the Amazon basin. A large-scale colonization program saw families from northeastern Brazil relocated to the forests, encouraged by promises of cheap land. Many settlements grew along the road from Brasília to Belém, but rainforest soil proved difficult to cultivate. Still, long-term development plans continued. Roads were cut through the forests, and in 1970, the work on the Trans-Amazonian Highway network began. The network's 3 pioneering highways were completed within 10 years but never fulfilled the promise. Large portions of the Trans-Amazonian and its accessory roads, such as BR 319, are derelict and impassable in the rainy season. Small towns and villages are scattered across the forest, and because its vegetation is so dense, some remote areas are still unexplored. With a population of 1.9 million people in 2014, Manaus is the largest city on the Amazon. Manaus alone makes up approximately 50% of the population of the largest Brazilian state of Amazonas. The racial makeup of the city is 64% Pardo and 32% white. Although the Amazon River remains largely undammed, around 412 dams are in operation in the Amazon's tributary rivers. For these 412 dams, 151 are constructed over 6 of the main tributary rivers that drain into the Amazon. Since only 4% of the Amazon's hydropower potential has been developed in countries like Brazil, more damming projects are underway and hundreds more are planned. After witnessing the negative effects of environmental degradation, sedimentation, navigation and flood control caused by the Three Gorges Dam in the Yangtze River, scientists are worried that constructing more dams in the Amazon will harm its biodiversity in the same way by blocking fish spawning runs, reducing the flows of vital oil nutrients and clearing forests. Damming the Amazon River could potentially bring about the end of free-flowing rivers and contribute to an ecosystem collapse that will cause major social problems. Origins: the most distant source of the Amazon was thought to be in the Apurimac River drainage for nearly a century. Such studies continued to be published even recently, such as in 1996, 2001, 2007, and 2008, where various authors identified the snow-capped 5,597 meters Nevado Esme Peak, located roughly 160 kilometers west of Lake Titicaca and 700 kilometers southeast of Lima, as the most distant source of the river. For that point, Quebrada Cahu Santo emerges from Nevado Esme, joins Quebrada Apachita and soon forms Rio La Cata, which becomes Rio Hornilos and eventually joins the Rio Apurimac. A 2014 study by Americans James Contis and Nicholas Tripchovich in Area, a peer-reviewed journal of the Royal Geographic Society, however, identifies the most distant source of the Amazon as actually being in the Rio Mantero drainage. A variety of methods were used to compare the lengths of the Mantero River versus the Apurimac River from the most distant source points to their confluence, showing the longer length of the Mantero. Then distances from Lago Janine to several potential source points in the uppermost Mantero River were measured, which enabled them to determine that the Cordillera Rumicras was the most distant source of water in the Mantero Basin. The most accurate measurement method was direct GPS measurement obtained by kayak descent of each of the rivers from the source points to their confluence. Obtaining these measurements was difficult given the class IVV nature of each of these rivers, especially in the lower abyss sections. Ultimately, they determined that the most distant point in the Mantero drainage is nearly 80 kilometers farther upstream compared to Mount Esme in the Apurimac drainage, and thus the maximal length of the Amazon River is about 80 kilometers longer than previously thought. Contis continued downstream to the ocean and finished the first complete descent of the Amazon River from its newly identified source, a journey repeated by two groups after the news spread. After about 700 kilometers, the Apurimac then joins Rio Mantero to form the Ain, which joins the Parine to form the Tambo, which joins the Urubamba to form the Ucayali. After the confluence of Apurimac and Ucayali, the river leaves Andean terrain and is surrounded by floodplain. For this point to the confluence of the Ucayali and the Maranon, some 1,600 kilometers, the forested banks are just above the water and are inundated long before the river attains its maximum flood stage. The low river banks are interrupted by only a few hills, and the river enters the enormous Amazon rainforest. The upper Amazon are Solomos, although the Ucayali-Maranon confluence is the point at which most geographers place the beginning of the Amazon River proper. In Brazil, the river is known at this point as the Solomos das Águas. The river systems and flood plains in Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia and Venezuela, whose waters drain into the Solomos and its tributaries, are called the Upper Amazon. The Amazon proper runs mostly through Brazil and Peru, and is part of the border between Colombia and Peru. It has a series of major tributaries in Colombia, Ecuador and Peru, some of which flow into the Maranon and Ucayali, and others directly into the Amazon proper. These include rivers Putumayo, Caqueta, Vorfast, Guaiana, Morona, Pastaza, Nucarai, Urichaiacu, Chambeira, Tigre, Nanay, Napo, and Walaga. At some points the river divides into anabranches, or multiple channels, are often very long, with inland and lateral channels, all connected by a complicated system of natural canals, cutting the low, flat Igapolands, which are never more than 5 meters above low river, into many islands. For the town of Canaria at the Great Bend of the Amazon to the Negro, vast areas of land are submerged at high water, above which only the upper part of the trees of the somber forests appear. Near the mouth of the Rio Negro to Serpa, nearly opposite the river Madeira, the banks of the Amazon are low until approaching Manaus. They rise to become rolling hills. The lower Amazon begins where the darkly colored waters of the Rio Negro meet the sandy-colored Rio Solomos, and for over 6 kilometers these waters run side by side without mixing. At Obidos, a bluff 17 meters above the river is backed by low hills. The lower Amazon seems to have once been a gulf of the Atlantic Ocean, the waters of which washed the cliffs near Obidos. Only about 10% of the Amazon's water enters downstream of Obidos, very little of which is from the northern slope of the valley. The drainage area of the Amazon basin above Obidos city is about 5 million square kilometers, and below only about 1 million square kilometers, exclusive of the 1,400,000 square kilometers of the Tocantins basin. The Tocantins River enters the southern portion of the Amazon Delta. In the lower reaches of the river, the north bank consists of a series of steep, table-topped hills extending for about 240 kilometers from opposite the mouth of the Xingu as far as Monte Alegre. These hills are cut down to a kind of terrace which lies between them and the river. On the south bank, above the Xingu, a line of low bluffs bordering the floodplain extends nearly to Santarém in a series of gentle curves before they bend to the southwest and, abutting upon the low Itapajos, merge into the bluffs which form the terrace margin of the Tapajos River Valley. Mouth Belém is the major city and port at the mouth of the river at the Atlantic Ocean. The definition of where exactly the mouth of the Amazon is located, and how wide it is a matter of dispute. Because of the area's peculiar geography, the Para and the Amazon are connected by a series of river channels called Furas near the town of Breves. Between them lies Maranhão, the world's largest combined river sea island. If the Para River and the Maranhão Island ocean frontage are included, the Amazon estuary is some 325 kilometers wide. In this case, the width of the mouth of the river is usually measured from Cabo Norte, the cape located straight east of Pracuba in the Brazilian state of Amapá, to Ponta da Tijuca near the town of Quiruca in the state of Para. A more conservative measurement excluding the Para River estuary, for the mouth south of the Araguari River to Ponta de Navio on the northern coast of Maranhão, would still give the mouth of the Amazon a width of over 180 kilometers. If only the river's main channel is considered, between the islands of Cura and Juripari, the width falls to about 15 kilometers. The plume generated by the river's discharge covers up to 1.3 million square kilometers and is responsible for muddy bottoms influencing a wide area of the tropical North Atlantic in terms of salinity, pH, light penetration, and sedimentation. Dispute regarding length. While debate as to whether the Amazon of the Nile is the world's longest river has gone on for many years, the historic consensus of geographic authorities has been to regard the Amazon as the second longest river in the world, with the Nile being the longest. However, the Amazon has been measured by different geographers as being anywhere between 6,259 and 6,800 kilometers long. It is often said to be at least 6,400 kilometers long. The Nile is reported to be anywhere from 5,499 to 6,690 kilometers. Often it is said to be about 6,650 kilometers long. There are many factors that can affect these measurements. A study by Brazilian scientists concluded that the Amazon is actually longer than the Nile, using Nevado Musmi, which in 2001 was labeled by the National Geographic Society as the Amazon's source. These scientists made new calculations of the Amazon's length. They calculated the Amazon's length as 6,992 kilometers. Using the same techniques, they calculated the length of the Nile as 6,853 kilometers, which is longer than previous estimates but still shorter than the Amazon. They made it possible by measuring the Amazon downstream to the beginning of the tidal estuary of Canal do Sal and then, after a sharp turn back, following tidal canals surrounding the Isle of Maranhão and finally including the marine waters of the Rio Paraíba in its entire length. Guido Gethli, director of science at the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, told the Brazilian TV network Globo in June 2007 that it could be considered as a fact that the Amazon was the longest river in the world. However, other geographers have had access to the same data since 2001, and a consensus has yet to emerge to support the claims of these Brazilian scientists. The length of both the Amazon and the Nile remains open to interpretation and continued debate.